This episode of New Politics was released on the 12th of June, 2026, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Was AUKUS ever really just about the submarines? And if Australia is integrating its military systems with the United States, what happens when those same systems become integrated with Israel's defence forces? These are the questions we need to keep asking because we're not getting any answers from the federal government. I'm Eddie Djokovic.
I'm David Lewis. All of this is coming up in this big episode of New Politics.
And if you're listening in and haven't subscribed to our website at New Politics, you're missing out on half of what we do. There's regular articles and analysis of this strange world of politics. It's all free, and you can subscribe at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, if you do want to support us, it's just $5 per month at Patreon and Substack, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
A little-known proposal moving through the U.S. Congress could reshape military ties between the U.S. and Israel for decades. It's called Section 224, and critics say it goes far beyond traditional military aid. The proposal would expand the joint development of military technologies, including artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, cyber capabilities, and advanced defense manufacturing. But critics argue it represents something much bigger, a long-term integration of U.S. and Israeli military technology that could become difficult to reverse.
Netanyahu actually wrote to the member of Congress to put this Section 224 into the bill.
Some analysts also question the growing role of Israeli-developed AI and surveillance technologies, arguing that systems used during Tel Aviv's genocidal war in Palestine's Gaza and deadly military raids in occupied Palestinian territories could become embedded within U.S. defense infrastructure. The proposal now heads to the House floor, where some lawmakers are still trying to strike the provision from the legislation. For critics, it could lock Washington into an even deeper military partnership with Tel Aviv, with no exit strategy for decades to come.
For almost 5 years, Australians have been told that the AUKUS deal is all about submarines, and there's been all of those questions about when will they arrive, how much will they cost, when will the United States actually deliver them, will they actually deliver them at all, and that's been a big question as well. But with a few developments taking place in the United States, it's becoming more apparent that these submarines were never actually the main story. And while the public has been focused on boats and costs, and we've been focused on that as well, David, over the past 5 years, but something much bigger has been happening behind the scenes. And we've raised this issue in the past, and that is that AUKUS is a project designed to integrate Australia more deeply and more fully into the American military and industrial systems than ever before. And that in itself is a big problem. But now there's even a bigger problem that's developing in the United States. And I think that it's something that should be ringing all the alarm bells in federal parliament. Now, there is a provision before the United States Congress, and it's part of the 2027 National Defence Authorization Act, and that proposes dramatically expanding defence technology cooperation between the United States and the State of Israel. And a lot of that includes AI, autonomous weapons, cyber warfare, missile defence, advanced military networks. And all of this would become a part of a more integrated defence structure, so that there's virtually no difference at all between the Israeli and US defence systems. And part of this process, and if this act does end up being passed by Congress, part of this process is to have direct US funding to Israel, so it doesn't have to be debated at all within US politics. It just ends up being another line item within the defence budget. So on its own, well, you might think, well, that's a political and military issue between the United States and Australia. What's it got to do with Australia? But this is where AUKUS comes into it, because the Australian and US Defence Forces are being synchronised with the same technology through the Pillar II part of AUKUS. So it means that if the IDF becomes embedded within the US defence system as well, it means that the Australian and Israeli defence systems will also be synchronised. And previously, David, our main complaints have been based around Australian defence decisions being made in Washington, but it looks like our defence decisions will be made in Tel Aviv as well, and that's something that I think we really need to be concerned about.
There's a sense, and I'm being very careful when I say this, that you can argue a close relationship with the United States is something that might be in Australia's interests over the long term and has been in the past. Now, before you all start shouting at me, I know that's when we look at the debacle that was Vietnam, the debacle that was Afghanistan, the debacle that was the Second Gulf War, which is not, of course, to disparage the Australian forces who went over there, but we should not have been there in the first place. There is still that argument that America and Australia have been close allies since 1909, then fortified in 1941, that America and Australia share similar values, not completely the same values. Now, this is all pre-Trump, of course. Trump changes things completely in the States from a governmental point of view, not necessarily from your normal American citizen point of view. Of course, when we see all these MAGA people, they really are the minority. Trump only scrapes in the election, and it's a low turnout, and there's other questionable data about that election that suggests that maybe the vote wasn't quite as accurately counted as it might have been. But the average American and the average Australian share more in common than they don't. Australian political values and American political values share more in common than not. Not everything is in common. So there is a sense in which hooking to America can be argued. Now, I've argued against it in the past, hooking to it to the level we are. I haven't changed my mind, and I'm not pro-US Australia defence in the way that it's being. But I am acknowledging that some might think, no, America and Australian defence ties are good. When it comes to Israel, it's a bit different. The current Israeli government doesn't really have a lot of shared values with us. Its treatment of the Palestinian people, its treatment of Lebanon, its treatment of Syria, its treatment of Iran in particular is not something that Australia should be supporting, and is not something that Australia would traditionally support, particularly the idea. And I know I'm getting into some really tricky moral questions here about Australia's complicity in genocides. But modern Australia likes to think of itself as a smaller liberal, democratic, egalitarian, non-racist, non-homophobic, non-sexist, all of the isms, all of the bad isms. And yet tying ourselves to Tel Aviv. And I note we've quietly changed our recognition of the capital back to Tel Aviv rather than Jerusalem, as Scott Morrison tried to make it. But it puts us into a field where we don't want to be anymore.
I think that's the key issue here. And also, Australia doesn't actually need to go overseas to be a part of genocide. It's actually had one here that just quietly, we won't talk about that one very much, but that's how I guess modern Australia looks at itself. Like it talks about all of these issues that might be happening overseas, but it never recognises the genocide that might be or has happened locally. But that's a separate issue for a different podcast, which we will look at in the future. But the word of the month, or the code word for the month, just seems to be interoperability. And that's been the buzzword that's been used by the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, quite a lot. And it's also been used by the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, a lot. And I suppose using operability as a code word is better than saying, oh, look, we're all being taken over by the United States military complex. It's a lot better to say just interoperability, but it just means that all of those military forces, the intelligence systems and all the command structures, well, they'll be so closely aligned that they will just operate as the one unit. And sure, there'll still be citizenship differences. There'll be Australian citizens, US citizens, Israeli citizens operating within those particular or respective military forces, but it just means that they'll be operating in the same structure. So you can have all this transferring between those different military forces. Now, I know that there's already this kind of structure that exists between Australia and the United States, but it is quite limited. But it means that once all of this stuff goes through, it would apply across the entire Defence Force in the United States, in Australia and Israel. And it would almost be like this de facto merged Defence Force. And then when you throw Israel into the mix, well, where this ends up is anyone's guess. And at the moment, there's no personnel relationship between the Australian and Israeli Defence Forces. You do have that, or you did have that recent situation where Australian citizens have gone off to serve in the IDF, but not as members of the Australian Defence Forces, or officially anyway. So this could create another dynamic that the Australian public is not currently aware of, but I think that they do need to be aware of. So that idea of joint Australian-Israeli military action on behalf of Israel, well, that is a possibility. And with America, you mentioned this before, Australia has joined in quite a few international interventions in Korea, in Vietnam, twice in Iraq, and then in Afghanistan. But this would take it to a totally different level.
Yeah, the arguments with the other ones were geopolitical enough that there was a kind of deniability of, oh, we have to do this. And Brendan Nelson mentioned it's about oil and then had to move back a bit. And of course, it's all about oil when it gets down to it. If it was a desert bereft of any profitable product, we'd be treating it like Siberia or Uzbekistan or places like that don't have a lot of natural resource. For many years, Muslims, Jews and Christians lived very happily in Eastern Europe, in places like Bulgaria, till the oil became an issue. And of course, it's not that one side or one religious group as a whole is provoking another religious group as a whole. It's individuals within and organizations within those groups with particular motives and ambitions. It's not everybody in any group, of course. And we shouldn't have to keep saying this, but we do, otherwise we get accused of being things that we're not. And one of the implications that might come up is, of course, Israel has conscription, compulsory military conscription, I think from the age of 18 to 21. You leave school, you go into the army, you serve your 3 years, and then you go to university or what have you, or travel the world, and that's absolutely Israel's business. That's how they want to run things. I'm wondering that under one of these defense things, whether it's possible, but certainly plausible, if they can start saying, oh, you're an Australian citizen, but you are of Jewish descent, and as a result, you are entitled to Israeli citizenship, and we've given you our Israeli citizenship, and guess what? Welcome to the IDF. See you
for the next 2 years.
Yeah, and that's wrong, of course. Doesn't matter what your background is. If you're an Australian citizen, you're an Australian citizen, and you should be immune from any country being able to say, oh, yeah, we will take you for our defence force, for our medical, for our... If you want to go, okay, good luck to you. Goodbye. Keep in touch. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. But if you don't want to go, what are the legal implications? And what would Australia do? Would Australia say, no, this is one of ours? He or she stays? Or would they say, oh, well, we've got this agreement, you better go, see you in 2 years, try not to get shot? It's not good. And you can say, oh, the Americans could have done it, the British couldn't really do it after 1948 with the introduction of Australian citizenship. And they'd organised it anyway, that the Australian Army was the Australian Army. And so they'd say, oh, we need you to fight in World War I or what have you, so you can work out how to send the troops over here. The Americans could never do it because it's completely separate citizenship model and completely separate citizenship anyway. New Zealand wouldn't do it. They might ask for help for Australia. I don't know that they would, and Canada again. But Israeli has that wrinkle in that any Jewish person can automatically become a citizen of Israel. And I'm not being conspiratorial here. You can all look this up. And if
it is quite factual as well. The thing is that a few people have said to us, look, this whole idea about Australia signing up to Israel's wars or actions against its neighbours and all that sort of stuff, that's a bit far-fetched. And surely there'd have to be a debate about it in Australia. And you think surely there would have to be a debate about that within Australia if it ever got to that. But when your military equipment and all of your intelligence is managed and implemented by the United States and by Israel, even if you've paid for all of this, well, you might find yourself in places that you might not necessarily want to end up in. And there's also blackmail issues with Israel and military operations. And a few people have been saying, oh, come on, that's not going to happen either. Israel doesn't do that sort of stuff. Well, that's exactly what the State of Israel does. And whenever there's any doubts about the actions and intentions of the State of Israel, well, you just have to look at some of its history. You have a look at the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty all the way back in 1967 when Israel deliberately torpedoed that US surveillance boat, and it was unarmed as well, and that happened in international waters, and then claimed that it was a mistake. And funnily enough, the US has never said no to Israel since that attack. And before that, there was the Lavon affair in 1954 when Israeli agents planted bombs in Egypt and then blamed the Egyptian government, and that was to place more pressure on the British government at the time. There was the King David Hotel bombing in 1946. Do I need to go on? But, you know, David, I'm sorry for being so anti-Semitic about this, but just putting out the facts out there and letting people know that this is how much Israel respects its allies. But for us, I just think that we need to be told exactly what we're signing up for within this whole AUKUS process. Not just the AUKUS deal, but what will happen once this legislation is passed by the United States Congress that they're currently debating, and I assume that the act will proceed in US Congress, but it's just about having an idea about what these long-term consequences are going to be. And so far, we know nothing about these long-term consequences.
Yeah, the whole notion that we were going to get 3 or 5 or whatever it was new submarines in 2050, maybe, perhaps, possibly, and they've downgraded it to second-hand submarines, and it's still maybe, perhaps, possibly. At what point do you say, yeah, this isn't a contract that really works for us, let's get out of it and strip Scott Morrison of his AC because he put us all into this, rather than spreading blame? We all know who's to blame, and Morrison is not the only one. The government has to say, we've had enough. We need to be our own sovereign nation. Yes, remain allies with the United States. Yes, remain allies with Britain. It's not about declaring war or even cutting diplomatic ties. It's about saying, no, these are the rules. If we can choose the people who come here and the circumstances under which they come, we can also choose the countries that we deal with and the circumstances in which we deal with them. And that's not being anti-Semitic. I'm not saying let's close the synagogues and let's treat Jewish people as second-class citizens. No, everyone's equal. Everyone is welcome. Everyone should be safe here. It is saying this is a bad government that doesn't have our best interests at heart. It doesn't matter who the government is, whether it's the American government, the English government, the New Zealand government. Hello to all our New Zealand listeners. I know it's not you. I'm just using you as an example. The Uzbekistani government, the Indian government, the Chinese government, it doesn't matter. If they're compromising our own national sovereignty, then we shouldn't be dealing with them, or we should be changing the rules. And Foreign Affairs used to be good enough that they could do that. I presume they still are. Hello to all our Foreign Affairs listeners. We've got to have courage in our politicians to say, no, we are Australian first. And I don't mean flag-waving, mindless Aussie, oi, oi, oi. I mean sensible, pragmatic, putting the idea of the citizens of the nation first, rather than kowtowing to every tin pot dictator who manages to cheat their way into a presidency, for example. So the Labor government is facing yet another test that so far it hasn't quite passed, but there's still time.
This is New Politics, independent analysis of Australian and international politics. For more free articles and analysis, join us at newpolitics.com.au.
And you mentioned quite a few of those different countries before: Uzbekistan, India, New Zealand. And I think it's also a question about
what does our Indian and Uzbekistani listeners too.
And there's scores of them out there, I'm pretty sure. Well, certainly New Zealand listeners. We do have listeners from India as well. So, well, big hello to them too.
Yeah,
but I think it is a question of what does sovereignty actually mean in the 21st century. Now, when you're looking in economic terms, there has been that move towards unification through currencies. We've got the euro in Europe. Several countries are working towards a common currency in Africa as well. And this idea hasn't really progressed, but there was a discussion about a common currency between Australia and New Zealand. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is that economic unions are never seen as threatening as military unions. But even still, when there are these sort of discussions about economic unions, there's always those who see it as a threat to independence. There are all those Eurosceptics in Britain who wanted to keep the pound, and that ultimately gave rise to Brexit. So of course that's always going to be a legitimate issue, but it seems like militarily we don't quite go that far, or we're not as sceptical about this sort of process. We're certainly sceptical about the process, but it's almost like the general public is sort of saying, well, you know, whatever, this is all going to happen, we can't do much about it. But I just think that through this AUKUS and Pillar II process, well, it might end up also being a case where you don't need to have these formal arrangements in place. Now that AUKUS has been signed and set up, you don't need to have a formal arrangement in place to become a military dependency. You don't have to go through this process of setting up a new pact or a new treaty agreement. It's already been done. It's already been done through AUKUS, and all of your military hardware then depends on Israel and the United States, or whoever else becomes a part of an agreement between the United States or with the United States as well. And we can already see this pathway developing, and that's what this AUKUS agreement does. So when Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of War in the US, demands that Australia increases its defence spending up to 3.5% of GDP, he did that with a megaphone last year. Well, Australia quietly does that and went up from 2.2% up to 3.1%. It's moving up to 3.5% of GDP. Or when there's a request for Australia to buy more US warplanes. That's what Australia does as well. So the US makes these demands and Australia has to acquiesce. And pretty soon, well, the state of Israel could be calling the shots as well, either directly or indirectly through the United States. And I just think that this is going to cause problems, or a lot of problems for the Australian government now, but also in the future if this act is passed by the US Congress, which is more than likely, as I've explained before. And at the moment, according to Pew International, 79% of the Australian population has got a negative view of the state of Israel, and 49% have got a highly negative view. And before we get accused of anti-Semitism yet again, David, Pew International is a highly reputable international research group that assesses and analyses this kind of information. So these are their figures, not ours, and now we'll be accused of anti-Semitism because we actively sought out this information. So we just can't win, David, so we'll just continue and persevere. So having an arrangement with a country that most of the Australian population has got a negative perspective of, well, I just don't think this is going to work out very well for Australia and the Australian government. But the real question is, well, where does the accountability for all of this lie, and who decides what's in Australia's best interest? And a lot of this just doesn't seem to be based in Australia's best interests.
And I'm trying to see the pro in the quid pro quo, or the quo in the quid pro quo, in that we're not getting any extra trade deals, maybe selling those extra Tim Tams to Britain, which was just a desperate attempt for the British government to try and demonstrate that leaving the European Union was the best thing it could do.
And we'll get their rubbish biscuits in return, and some Marmite, I think it is.
I think Marmite, yes.
That is a good deal.
They didn't see us coming. And obviously, Britain itself is in dire straits at the moment. Some analysts are saying that it's ungovernable. It's looking at its sixth prime minister in 8 years or something, or 9 years, which is not a good record. In 9 years, one or two prime ministers, maybe three, because you might have had a health issue or something. But yeah, 6 is way too many. We've got America in crisis with an unstable and seemingly very unhealthy president who's leading a vacuum with nobody there to stabilise, with nobody there to make sure that the president's more unhinged tendencies are at least tempered a little bit. Australia isn't in such a political crisis, but we've got maybe a couple of domestic crises coming up. We still have a feral media that blows every little thing out of proportion. We've got a collapsing health system. We've got an education system that's collapsing. These might not lead to big problems now, but down the track, they're going to lead to big problems. We have a stable government, federal government, perhaps too stable with a vacuum where the opposition is. I know that One Nation is polling well at the moment. I don't know that they will continue to poll well. So we may end up with a government with no opposition and with no taste for reform in a time where Australia is screaming for reform, or a limited taste, let's be fair, a limited taste for reform. They have started looking at the capital gains system and negative gearing and all of that. So I can't say that they're not reforming, but the pace of reform is much slower than a lot of people want. Now, there are reasons for that. We have a Liberal Party that's dead in the water. We have a National Party that, even if it's healthy, is going to win no more than about 15 or 16 seats on the eastern states. So while we're not in crisis yet, all the signs are there that we will be in the types of existential crises that our more inverted commas senior, close inverted commas, partners will find themselves in.
And I think a lot of this gets back to where we started with all of this, and it's nice to circle back to the beginning point, but we've been having that wrong debate about AUKUS overall, and I think that we've really been sold down the river by our leaders. Couldn't be bothered, and this sort of relates to the rise in One Nation as well, but they couldn't be bothered telling us about what this is all really about. And essentially, it's about solving US debt problems and contributing to the US military industrial complex as well. So that's what a lot of this is all about, and it's also adding to our own debt problems. Why anyone would sign up to this is beyond me, but I think it's a big part of an even bigger problem across so many issues. We talked about it before. People just feel like they're being gaslit or being lied to, and they just don't trust the institutions that are making these decisions on their behalf. And I think that when there is that disconnect, people start looking at alternatives. They start looking at political alternatives. And I think that's what's happening with One Nation at the moment. They are leading in the primary vote in opinion polling at the moment. And I agree with you, David. I'm not sure if it's going to hold up at that point for forever. Yeah, forever. Well, definitely not for 2 years. And I just don't think that they offer any solutions. We've been consistently pointing that out, that they just do not offer the solutions, irrespective of how much political or primary support they've got at the moment. And if anything, they'd be fast-tracking that relationship with Israel and probably run the government offices or opposition from Tel Aviv if it ever got to that point. But, definitely there should have been a much broader discussion about AUKUS. And as we mentioned last week, there is that independent inquiry into AUKUS, which is being chaired by Peter Garrett, and that's totally independent of government. But there needs to be a parliamentary inquiry as well, run by government. We just need to know, once that legislation is passed in the US Congress, we just need to know what's going to happen here. And it might be a case where the government doesn't really want to know what the public thinks about all of this, because they just know that they would say no to AUKUS and any arrangements that include the state of Israel. But these are not that it's up to the public to decide, but it's the government that decides all of these sort of things. But they just don't want to see that political blowback, I guess. But these are the long-term consequences that we need to look out for and understand, at least. And there will be new leaders that will have to sort all of this stuff out in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but there just hasn't been any parliamentary scrutiny at all about any of these deals. And I think the better question probably is, well, what sort of country does Australia want to be or want to become? And what's the perception that our leaders have got of Australia? Because at the moment, it just seems like the only ambition that they have for Australia on the world stage is to be the bootlicker of the United States and for the state of Israel. And that's not really an ambition that any country in the world should have.
No. The other thing I'll point out about One Nation that just occurred to me, when they realise that the Israeli government is Jewish, their opinions might change and they'll find themselves in a very awkward position given that side of politics at that level, at that extent. And I'm certainly not saying everyone on the right, but there is an anti-Jewish feeling, and a lot of the conspiracy when you hear, oh, the banks run the world, and the banks run by the Rothschild, I see. But yeah, to get back to your other point, it is disappointing that we seem to have misinterpreted the national anthem. Advance Australia Fair isn't Advance Australia so it's fair and everybody gets a bit. It's Advance Australia Fair being pretty Australia. It's a poetic term. Beautiful Australia that is aesthetically pleasing, which of course doesn't scan in the melody. Advance the aesthetically pleasing Australia is probably more accurate. We don't seem to have a lot of people wanting to advance Australia except in the shadow of other countries. And it's going to cost everybody, including those who aren't working their hardest to advance Australia. I'm not a fan of the national anthem, I must say, but we've got to interpret it properly. I think we do need...
Well, the other factor is that Australia is not a big country, it's not a small country, it's somewhere in between. It's 28 million people, which is relatively small on a world stage. But yeah, politically we should be having a lot more clout than what we've got. But perhaps the government is being pragmatic about where we are positioned within world politics.
Sure. And again, I'm not saying completely dump the social and political ties we have with the United States.
But you do seem to be saying dump the national anthem.
I think Waltzing Matilda's a better choice, but it's a little bit radical, being a song coming out of the 1890s shearers' strike. But I'm not saying that it's even possible to get rid of the trade. We've argued here before that we can't really drop our relationship with China because it would be too expensive for us. It's the same with the United States. We have a lot of trade with the United States, not so much tourism anymore. Unfortunately, people like you and I, Eddie, who might want to go to the United States are unlikely to get through because there's people who've said far less than we have. And we haven't...
we haven't called for a revolution on the streets of the USA.
No, we've just said we disagree with some of the policies of the United States without saying anything more, really. And yet we wouldn't get a visa at the moment because people have been much less obviously critical who've not been allowed in. So the tourism is a problem for the states. But I am saying that Australia needs to act far more like a sovereign nation and keep its own national, and that's international politics, making sure that you keep your allies without compromising yourself too much. You can compromise, but not yourself. And I might be wrong. And if you think I am wrong, please let us know politely and gently in the comments. I think that Australia stepping away from this agreement and renegotiating it so that we're not paying $328 billion, which is cut into our NDIS, which is cut into a whole lot of social services because the money's not there anymore. At what point do we say, no, we need to look after our own citizens and our own permanent residents and our own borders and our own defence in a way that's practical, useful, and doesn't behold us to too many other people in too costly a way?
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you value independent journalism without the influence of corporate backing, join New Politics at newpolitics.com.au and support us directly. It's just $5 per month, and we always try to keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.